There is a rule at Whitmore Academy that isn't written in any handbook, isn't mentioned during orientation, and isn't spoken about anywhere a teacher might overhear it. And yet every single student who has ever slept in Founders Hall knows it by heart before their first week is over. If you're on the top bunk and the bed starts to shake, you do not open your eyes. This is the story of the one time a boy named Cody Ellison broke that rule on purpose, and what he saw in the half second before he made himself look away again. Cody transferred to Whitmore in the fall of his junior year, a lanky, restless kid from outside Columbus, Ohio, who'd spent his whole life being told he asked too many questions. He arrived at Founders Hall with a genuine curiosity about the building's age, the kind of interest that made him linger in hallways studying the water-stained ceiling tiles and the uneven floorboards other students stepped over without a second thought. And it was this same curiosity that made him, within his first 2 weeks, the only new student to actually ask his roommate why nobody in the third-floor wing would take the top bunk voluntarily. His roommate, a broad-shouldered senior named Bryce Talbot, gave him the short version first, the version everyone got. Something shook the top bunks at night, gently to start, worse as the weeks passed. And if you ever gave in and looked to see what was doing it, you woke up the next morning to find the bed empty and the sheets tucked as though nobody had slept there at all. Bryce delivered this the way you'd warn someone about a loose stare, matter of fact, almost bored, and Cody, still new enough to find the whole thing more interesting than frightening, pressed for details Bryce clearly didn't want to give. What year did it start? Who was the first one it took? Why the top bunk specifically, and not the bottom? Bryce answered exactly one of these questions, telling him only that it went back to sometime in the 1950s, before Whitmore was Whitmore at all, when the building had operated as a boys' home for kids nobody else wanted, and that the top bunks back then had been reserved for the ones being punished. Whatever happened to those kids, Bryce said, it apparently never really left. Cody laughed it off in front of Bryce, the way you're supposed to when a story sounds too much like the kind adults tell to keep kids from sneaking out at night. But the laugh didn't survive his first week in that bed. It started on a Tuesday, a shudder so faint he assumed it was a truck downshifting somewhere on the county road outside. And by Thursday, it had returned twice, each time a little longer, a little more deliberate, the kind of motion that had a rhythm to it rather than the randomness of an old building settling. He didn't tell Bryce right away. He wanted, in the stubborn way that had gotten him in trouble at every school he'd ever attended, to understand it first, and understanding, to Cody, meant documentation. He started keeping a log on his phone, timestamps and descriptions, and within 2 weeks, he had enough entries to notice a pattern nobody else at Whitmore seemed to have bothered tracking. The shaking always started between 12:40 and 1:10 in the morning, always built for roughly 11 minutes, and always stopped the instant he made any sound at all. A cough, a shifted breath, anything that proved he was awake. It was almost, he wrote in his notes one night, like it wanted him listening. Not sleeping through it, listening. By the 3rd week of October, Cody had become quietly convinced that if the shaking wanted an audience, then the danger wasn't in the shaking itself. It was in what happened once you gave it more than that, once you opened your eyes and let it know you'd crossed from listening into looking. He decided, with the confidence of someone who has never once been wrong about anything that mattered to him, that he could test the boundary of that rule without breaking it entirely. He would not open his eyes, but he would, just once, reach a hand out into the dark past the edge of his mattress, just far enough to feel whatever was moving it. He picked a Friday night for it, reasoning that a weekend gave him room to recover if things went badly, and he lay awake long after Bryce's breathing had gone slow and even below him, waiting. The shaking began right on schedule, and Cody let it build for almost the full 11 minutes before he moved, sliding his right hand slowly off the edge of the mattress into the cold air beside the bed frame, fingers spread, heart slamming so hard he was sure it would give him away before his hand ever found anything. For 3 full seconds, nothing. And then his fingers brushed something that was not the bed frame, not the wall, not anything that belonged in that space at all. Something with a texture like wet rope left out in winter, and it did not pull away from his touch. It pressed back. Every instinct in Cody's body told him to scream, to yank his hand back, to do anything but what he actually did, which was force himself to lie perfectly still while that unbearable pressure held against his fingertips for what felt like an entire minute, testing, the way you'd test whether a trap had actually caught something. When it finally withdrew, the shaking stopped instantly, and the silence that followed was so complete that Cody could hear his own pulse in his ears. He didn't sleep again that night, and he didn't touch that darkness a second time, not ever. No matter how many nights afterward he lay awake wondering exactly what he'd felt. He told Bryce everything the next morning, and for once his roommate didn't dismiss him with the weary shrug Cody had come to expect. Instead, Bryce went quiet for a long moment before admitting something he'd never told anyone at Whitmore, not even his closest friends. That 2 years earlier, before Cody had transferred in, a freshman named Marcus DeWitt had lived in that exact bunk for 1 semester before vanishing during winter recess. The school's official story was a family emergency, a sudden withdrawal, the kind of explanation that satisfied administrators and nobody else. But Bryce had seen Marcus's parents on campus the following spring, quietly picking up the last of his belongings, and he'd watched the mother stand in the doorway of Founders Hall for a long time afterward, staring up at the third-floor windows with an expression Bryce said he still thought about sometimes, an expression that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with dread. That detail changed something in Cody. Where curiosity had driven him before, something closer to fear took over now, and he spent the following weeks doing everything he could to simply survive the remaining months in that room without further incident, keeping his hands beneath the blanket, his eyes shut, his breathing even, no matter how badly the shaking escalated as November wore on. It did escalate, more than it ever had before, as though whatever lived in that darkness had taken his single act of contact as an invitation rather than a boundary, and by December the 11-minute pattern had stretched to nearly 20, the pressure against the mattress growing heavier, more insistent, until some nights Cody genuinely believed the frame itself might buckle beneath him. The night it finally reached its peak came just before winter break, when Cody, exhausted past the point of caution, felt the mattress lift almost entirely off its frame on one side, felt himself sliding toward the edge despite every effort to stay still, and understood, with a clarity that cut through his terror, that this was the night it intended to finish whatever it had started weeks earlier when his hand first touched it in the dark. He does not remember deciding to move. He remembers only that his body rolled itself off the low side of the bed and onto the floor a half-second before the mattress would have tipped him the other way entirely, and that he lay there on the cold floorboards through the rest of the night, shaking as hard as the bed had been, listening to the frame above him settle slowly back into stillness. He never slept in that bunk again, sleeping on the floor in a borrowed sleeping bag for the final 2 weeks before break, and requesting a transfer the moment classes resumed in January. A request the housing office granted without a single follow-up question, the way Cody had come to understand they always did. He finished out his time at Whitmore in a different dormitory entirely, and though he never spoke publicly about what had happened in Founders Hall, he kept his handwritten log from that fall folded inside an old paperback for years afterward, unable to throw it away and equally unable to read it again. And he never, for the rest of his life, reached his hand into the dark beside any bed without first checking, carefully, that there was nothing there to touch. Riley Danvers has told this story exactly twice in the 11 years since it happened. Once to a therapist who didn't believe a word of it, and once, much later, to a stranger on a long flight who happened to mention growing up near the same stretch of Georgia coastline. This is the 3rd time, and Riley still insists on one condition before it's told at all, that whoever hears it understands this isn't a story about a haunting. It's a story about the night Riley watched a roommate disappear from 4 feet away and did absolutely nothing to stop it, because nobody had ever explained that doing nothing was the only thing that would have worked. The two of them met the way most roommates at Marsh Point Academy did, by random assignment, arriving on the same August afternoon with duffel bags and the particular nervous energy of 2 15-year-olds who'd never lived away from home before. Riley's roommate was a girl named Sadie Kowalski, quick to laugh, quicker to talk, the kind of person who made an unfamiliar dorm room feel less like a cell within the first hour simply by filling it with noise. They drew their bunks by coin flip on move-in day, the way the school always did, and Sadie, delighted, called top bunk before the coin had even finished spinning, joking that she'd always wanted to sleep close enough to the ceiling to touch it. Neither of them heard the rumors until the 2nd week, and even then it arrived sideways, the way these things always do, filtered through an older student's offhand comment in the dining hall about how she was glad she wasn't the one stuck on top this year in Sadie and Riley's room. Sadie laughed it off entirely, the way she laughed off most things, and told Riley she wasn't about to lose sleep over a ghost story some junior had probably invented to mess with freshmen. Riley wanted to believe that too, wanted it badly enough that when the shaking started 3 weeks later, faint and easily explained away as an old building settling, neither of them thought much of it at all. It got worse before either of them admitted it was happening. Riley remembers lying awake one night in late September, listening to the frame above creak in a rhythm too steady to be accidental, and choosing, out of some instincts she still can't fully explain, to say nothing rather than wake Sadie and risk sounding paranoid. That silence became a habit over the following weeks, both of them noticing, both of them saying nothing. Until one night in October, Sadie finally broke first, leaning over the edge of her bunk in the dark to whisper down to Riley that something had been shaking her bed almost every night for 2 weeks. And had Riley heard it too? Riley said yes. And in that moment, lying 4 feet apart in the dark, admitting it out loud to each other for the first time, they made the decision that Riley has spent every year since wishing they'd made differently. They agreed to keep it between themselves rather than tell an adult, certain that reporting it would only get them labeled as the weird roommates nobody wanted to room with next year. What they didn't know, because nobody at Marsh Point ever bothered warning incoming freshmen properly, was the rule itself, the single piece of information that generations of Marsh Point students before them had quietly passed down, and that Sadie and Riley, through nothing but bad luck and an unusually quiet friend group, had simply never been told. Whatever happens, whoever is on top does not look. Not once, not even for a second. By November, the shaking had become nightly, severe enough that Sadie started sleeping in her clothes, ready to bolt, though bolt where, she never said. Riley offered to switch bunks more than once, but Sadie always refused, insisting stubbornly that she wasn't going to let some old building scare her out of her own bed. A stubbornness that Riley now understands, looking back, was less bravery than simple ignorance of what she was actually up against. The two of them grew closer through it in a strange way, bonded by a shared secret neither of them fully understood, whispering in the dark some nights about what it might be, laughing nervously about it in daylight to keep the fear from calcifying into something neither of them could function under. The night it happened was a Tuesday in the first week of December, unremarkable in every way until it wasn't. Riley remembers waking somewhere around 1 a.m. to the sound of the frame above shaking harder than it ever had, hard enough that dust sifted down from the joints of the bed onto her own blanket below, and remembers lying rigid, eyes shut out of simple learned instinct even though nobody had ever told her that instinct was correct. She heard Sadie's breathing change above her, heard it go from the slow rhythm of sleep to something sharper, more alert, and understood with a sick lurch that her roommate had woken up into the middle of it. What happened next took perhaps 4 seconds, though Riley has relived it so many times since that it feels, in memory, like it lasted much longer. She heard Sadie gasp, a short, startled sound, followed immediately by the unmistakable creak of someone sitting upright. Riley, still facing the wall, still following the only instinct she had, did not turn to look. She heard no scream. She heard no struggle. She heard only a single sound she has never been able to fully describe to anyone. Something between a rush of air and the closing of a heavy door. And then the room went completely, totally silent. Riley lay frozen for what felt like an hour before she finally worked up the courage to sit up and look toward the bunk above her, and found that exactly as it should have been if Sadie had simply gotten up in the night. Sheets neatly folded back, pillow undisturbed, every one of Sadie's belongings still in their place on the shelf beside the bed. Sadie herself was gone, not from the room only, but from the school entirely, from every record the administration could produce when Riley's parents demanded answers, from every enrollment file, every yearbook photo taken that fall, as though the school itself had scrambled in the following days to erase any evidence she'd ever been there at all, offering Riley's frantic parents only a single, unconvincing explanation about an emergency family transfer that nobody, least of all Riley, ever believed. Riley left Marsh Point at the end of that semester and never returned, carrying for the rest of her life a guilt that no therapist has ever fully managed to talk her out of, the guilt of having heard everything and done nothing, even though every person who has ever heard this story in full has told her the same thing, that looking would only have meant losing 2 roommates that night instead of 1. Riley knows this. She still doesn't sleep well in rooms with bunk beds, still keeps a lamp on through the night wherever she stays, and still, 11 years later, wonders sometimes whether Sadie is still out there somewhere, in whatever place things go when they vanish from a top bunk in the middle of the night, waiting for someone to finally come looking. Somewhere in the archives of Ridgemont Preparatory School in upstate New York, buried in a locked filing cabinet that only 2 members of the current administration even know exists, there is a list of names, 7 of them, spanning a period of 61 years, each one connected to the exact same top bunk in the exact same room on the 3rd floor of Ridgemont's oldest dormitory. This is the story of that list, and of the 3 very different students, separated by decades, whose lives it quietly connected long before any of them knew the others existed. The first name on the list belongs to a boy named Walter Higgins, who slept in that bunk during the winter of 1962, back when Ridgemont still enforced a rigid, almost military discipline over its students, and complaints of any kind were treated as evidence of weakness rather than legitimate concern. Walter's story survives only in fragments, a few lines in an old headmaster's private journal discovered decades later during a renovation, describing a student who had reported, repeatedly and with increasing desperation, that his bed shook every night and that he'd begun seeing a shape crouched at its foot whenever he dared to open his eyes. The headmaster's journal notes, with chilling institutional coldness, that Walter was disciplined for disruptive fabrication on 3 separate occasions before he was found missing from his bed one January morning. His absence recorded not as a disappearance, but as an unauthorized departure. The matter closed within a week and never formally investigated again. The second name belongs to a girl named Denise Ashworth, who slept in that same bunk 29 years later, in 1991, during a period when Ridgemont had gone coeducational and the old dormitory had been quietly repurposed without anyone bothering to consider what history it carried with it. Denise was sharp, skeptical, the kind of student who dismissed the whispered warnings from older girls as exactly the sort of nonsense meant to scare freshmen, right up until the night in October when she woke to her mattress trembling beneath her with a rhythm too deliberate to explain away. Denise, unlike Walter, had at least been warned about the rule, don't look, don't react, and she managed, through sheer stubborn willpower, to survive nearly the entire school year following it faithfully, keeping a private diary that would later become the second entry in what eventually became known, among the handful of staff who learned of it, as the list. Her diary describes months of escalating disturbance, the shaking joined eventually by a faint, rhythmic tapping against the headboard. 3 taps and a pause, always at exactly 1:15 in the morning. And it ends abruptly in May of 1991, the final entry reading only, in handwriting notably less steady than her earlier pages, that she'd heard, for the first time, her own name whispered from somewhere close to the ceiling, and that she didn't think she could make it to graduation. Denise did make it to graduation, in fact, transferring dormitories after that entry, and never speaking of the experience again, as far as anyone could determine. Though the diary itself was discovered years later, tucked inside a hollowed-out textbook left behind in a donation box. And it was that diary, more than anything else, that convinced a young dean of students in the early 2000s to start quietly compiling the list in the first place, cross-referencing decades of withdrawal records, health office visits, and dormitory transfer requests, until an unmistakable pattern of names connected to that single bunk began to emerge. The third name on the list, and the most recent, belongs to a 17-year-old junior named Trevor Aldana, who arrived at Ridgemont in the fall 2 years ago with absolutely no knowledge of Walter Higgins, Denise Ashworth, or the 5 other names that had been quietly added to the list in the decades between them. Trevor was, like most of the names before him, assigned to that room by nothing more than the ordinary administrative process of matching incoming students to available beds, and he might have gone the entire year without ever learning about the list at all, if not for a chance conversation with a groundskeeper named Otis Brennan, one of the 2 staff members who actually knew the cabinet where the list was kept. Otis had noticed something in Trevor during the first month of the semester. A particular hollow look around the eyes that he recognized, uncomfortably, from students he'd watched come through that same building for over 20 years. And one afternoon in October, against every policy the school had ever quietly enforced about keeping the matter buried, he pulled Trevor aside and told him the truth. He told him about the list, about the 7 names, about the pattern that connected a bed shaking in 1962 to a bed shaking in 1991. To whatever Trevor himself had almost certainly already started experiencing. And he told him, most importantly, the one piece of advice that had apparently been passed down among the very few staff who knew anything at all, that the shaking itself had never once, in 61 years, actually harmed anyone. It was only ever the looking that did. Trevor listened to all of it in a kind of stunned, grateful silence, because the shaking had in fact already started 3 weeks earlier, and he'd spent every night since telling himself it was nothing. A loose bed frame, an overactive imagination, anything but what his gut had already told him it was. Armed now with Otis's warning, Trevor did something none of the 7 names before him had fully managed. He survived the entire remainder of the school year in that bunk, faithfully keeping his eyes shut through every escalation, through the tapping that started in December and the whispering that started in February, refusing every single night to give the thing in that room the one reaction it seemed to want above all others. He graduated the following spring, the 8th name to be added to Otis's list, but the first one in 61 years to be added under the word survived rather than a question mark. And before he left Ridgemont for good, he asked Otis one final question that the old groundskeeper still doesn't have a good answer for. He asked what happened to whatever was in that room now that it had gone an entire year without getting what it wanted. Otis told him, honestly, that he didn't know, that in over 2 decades of quietly watching that bunk, he'd never once seen a student successfully resist it for a full year before, and that he had no idea whether that meant the pattern had finally been broken, or whether it simply meant that whatever waited in room 314 was now hungrier and more patient than it had ever been for any of the 7 names that came before. The 9th name on the list was added the following autumn. Otis has never told anyone what it says,